and welcome to Bruxelles Je t'aime, Euronews' talk show all about the European capital of Brussels. On Brussels, my love, we break down the big stories of the week, examine what's at stake for you and for Europe. My name is Maeve McMahon. Thank you so much for joining us. Coming up this week, the race to go green is on. The challenge, not to scare away businesses while doing so. While the EU readies its EU Green Deal industrial plan, France and Germany sent ministers to the White House this week to call for full transparency within the US Inflation Reduction Act. EU leaders chewed over all this and more at their EU summit in Brussels this week. We break down this new headache for European businesses, still suffering the consequences of the energy crisis and the pandemic. And 28 million. That's the number of people who earn a living delivering food to our doors or giving us rides. The so-called platform worker sector is booming, made profits of €14 billion in 2020, but yet Uber drivers or home delivery riders still have no basic rights. Under pressure for years to address this, the European Commission came up with a proposal. MEPs voted on it last week, but politicians are still divided on whether these workers are self-employed or should be recognised as real employees with real rights. To talk about these topics and much, much more, I'm joined here in our studio by the German MEP, Dr. Christian Ehler from the European People's Party. I'm also joined by the Belgian MEP, Marc Botenga from the left, and also by the Deputy Director General of Business Europe, that is Luisa Santos. Welcome to Euronews. So the talk of the town here in Brussels this week was this looming proposal that the European Commission is cooking up right now in order to protect European businesses feeling threatened by the US IRA, which is, of course, Joe Biden's massive green subsidy package. Before we hear from our panel, let's just take a listen to the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen presenting her plans to the press.
We will therefore propose the Net Zero Industry Act. It will focus on the key technologies for the shift to net zero. It will speed up permitting. This is one of the major complaints when you speak to the business, the net zero industry. The major complaint is always the permitting processes. And it will incentivize multi-country projects. A big focus is on cutting red tape. And it will set targets for what we need till 2030, because there's a simple equation: only what gets measured gets done.
That's the European Commission President there, Ursula von der Leyen, presenting her plan. So I'd like to start first getting the perspective from Business Europe, from Luisa Santos, and then hear from our MEPs, because I know business have been asking for a European IRA. Is this exactly what you're looking for?
Well, we have not been asking exactly for a European IRA, because there are issues in IRA we're not happy with. We don't like discriminatory provisions. We don't like Buy American provisions, and these are all things that we are still trying to address in our discussions with our US colleagues. What we do like is visibility on the support for business, how to access these funds, how to make sure that business can invest in green technologies, and how and what they can expect to achieve this. So this is the visibility, the stability, the predictability, the easiness. This is what we like. And the fact also that we see this as an important step to make sure that the US is also engaged in fighting climate change.
So that's what you like from the IRA. So the US's IRA. I'll come back to you in a minute to get your perspective on this proposal from the European Commission President. But first, Marc Botenga, you are from the left group. How have you been digesting what's been going on? And of course, that proposal that's been cooked up at the moment to be presented in March, and the presentation there from Ursula von der Leyen.
Well, I think, first of all, we shouldn't underestimate what's going on in the United States. I mean, it's very clear that there's an attempt from the United States to attract business, to attract also European businesses. Belgian Prime Minister has been very clear on this as well, saying there's been phone calls to companies currently investing or established in Belgium, in Germany as well, to kind of convince them to perhaps in the future invest rather in the United States. Now, this is not the behavior you would be expecting from a key ally, because, you know, obviously the United States are considered a key European ally, especially in a situation of war. So we should not underestimate it. But then if we look at the reply of the Commission, it's very much in line with everything that's been done before. There's no clear rupture, no clear break with previous policies, and in that sense, it's very disappointing. Well, yes, I mean, we have seen throughout Europe, in different countries, a deindustrialization. You know, throughout. I mean, we can take different regions throughout Europe that have suffered from this, and we do not see today a clear response from the European Commission saying, okay, how are we going to break with what hasn't worked in the past in order to make sure that we get where we want to get and, you know, have a green European industry?
Your political group, the centre-right European People's Party, put a statement on Twitter saying that this proposal was perhaps too little too late. What is your reaction?
True. I mean, what we see right now is a systematic challenge by the Americans. I think in principle we welcome that. They're buying into CO2 reduction. They're buying into the whole international setting. But they systematically challenge the European way. And we did it by regulation. And they do that by incentives. And that seems to be very attractive. And I wouldn't say that it threatens European industry. I mean, it's an offer to European industry, but it's threatening employment and it's threatening the European economy.
Well, let's just remind our viewers what exactly this plan of Joe Biden is, what this US Inflation Reduction Act is. The aspiration, I believe, is to provide $369 billion to speed up climate transition over the next decade, also promote American-made green technology through tax credits and rebates, and also make it cheaper for American consumers to buy American heat pumps, solar panels and electric vehicles. Whereas the proposal that we saw from the Commission hopes to loosen subsidy rules to cover all green energy sectors, repurpose, one of the favourite words of the European Commission, so repurpose EU funds, and also simplify permitting for EU-based green projects. So there we go, a little bit of a comparison. So we've heard your reaction earlier to the IRA. What about this presentation from Ursula?
Well, there's one positive aspect to start with, is that the Green Deal comes now with the industrial plan. This should have been happening since the start, and it didn't. And this is important because you cannot only have regulations imposing obligations to companies, you need to have an all approach that includes other policy areas. And we're very happy to see that trade is there to play a role. It's also important to leverage even further the single market, and that's why when we are talking about a European response, we need to be careful also not to lead to further fragmentation of the single market. This is very important. And the other important thing that we see is the idea that things are there in Europe. We have already subsidies, we have available support to companies, but the question is, are these visible for companies? Are these reliable? Are companies able to access them in a normal or a reasonable period of time? And this is what we're still missing in Europe. So we think, for instance, faster permits is definitely one thing. What is still missing, and this is very important for us, is the heavy of regulation. So we have a problem in Europe of structural costs that come from higher energy prices than the US, but also the fact that we have a lot of regulation. Not all of them is bad, necessarily bad, but what we need to make sure is that whether this regulation is at this stage not weighing too much on business. And therefore, what we are asking is a simplification also of
We're sitting
some of
here
these
in front of
regulations.
two European legislators, and funny that you mentioned that, because I was at a briefing or a panel recently in Brussels where one industry member said that China is not a threat to the European Union, but the European Union itself is a major threat to itself because of this heavy regulation, this red tape, and this burden that they're putting on industry. I mean, is this something that you think is possible to change? Christian Ehler.
I mean, true. That started as a Green Deal, but we lost a little bit the ambition on the deal. And as it had been said before, I mean, we're lacking, for example, the transition pathways for the industrial sectors. We are over-descriptive. We want to regulate practically all instead of saying we have principal goals and then let the industry do. We are not technology open. We have a repair unit which is called state aid, which is painfully slow. I mean, it takes at average 18 months to decide on state subsidies, whether member states can grant that. So in a way, we got more and more a one-trick pony. We want to do everything by regulation, and that is really challenged by an incentive-driven system, as the Americans had been suggesting.
I mean, 18 months is just too long. It's too long for people to wait around, and the planet certainly won't wait either. Mark Botenga, what do you think?
No, I think, I mean, obviously, you know, if you listen to the lobbies of big multinationals, they want two things. First, free money, and as little rules as possible. Now, we have seen throughout the last years and decade, indeed, that doing this kind of tax incentives and free money to multinationals does not guarantee employment. We've had a number of very recent examples in Belgium, in France, in Italy, with companies receiving state aid and still laying off workers or closing down altogether. So, and the Commission is now entering in this kind of belly dance of saying, the United States are going to give a lot of money, so we'll give a lot of money as well, deregulate a little bit, and, we're more attractive, please invest. But that offers no guarantees, neither to workers nor to the climate. So either we want to take, indeed, in public hands some of this industrial transition, and to also force companies to invest in the green transition, because you have companies that say, we will do some green project as long as you give us money. But at the meanwhile, we'll still invest in fossil fuels or in polluting. So if we're just belly dancing in front of companies, we're not doing our job. That's obviously what they want, but we need something different.
I can almost visualize that metaphor there. Luisa Santos, I'll hear from you.
No, I would like to respond to this one, because, this idea that companies only want money and they will only invest if they have money is not correct. Companies are investing if they have a business case. And having a business case, meaning that if you are investing in certain technology, including green technology, you are expecting that you're going to make money of it, that you're going to be able to deploy that technology in a reasonable period of time. And this at the moment in Europe is not a given. And that's why if you have a model in the US that grants you this, of course you think twice whether you're going to invest in Europe or in the US. But the problem of heavy regulation is not for big multinationals, it's for smaller companies. We have, I don't know how many regulations coming up in Europe right now that demand huge reporting for companies. Now, big companies, they can hire people and they can do that. The problem is going to be the smaller ones. Because instead of doing business, they will be doing reporting.
No, but I think this is interesting, and it is true that indeed companies, if it is not profitable, they will not invest. But perhaps at some point we need to say, you have not invested in the clean and the renewable energies we wanted, we needed over the last 10, 20 years. Private investment has not been what it should have been, and so we should do it through public investment, because just offering them subsidies to do it for us is just opening free money for the company. So I don't think that's a solution, because it has not worked. So we need to look at, okay, what sectors are really strategic? What sectors can we, publicly invest in and develop if private business does not want to do it? So I think this is really important. Secondly, let's be clear, the European Commission's proposal is even less ambitious than the US proposal socially. So at least in the United States, Joe Biden, he says, and I'm not a big fan of him, I'm not on the same political line, but he says we want an increase in workers' rights and an increase in salaries. European Commission says, no, never mind, we'll just put it on skills.
Christian Ehler, what do you think? I don't know if you caught the speech of Joe Biden, the president, this week, his State of the Union, where he did a bit of a victory parade there regarding his IRA.
Let's be honest. The reason why they're doing that is not so much their interest in clean tech industries. They lost their ability to produce. They had been outsourcing. The globalization had been very problematic for the ability in America to produce, the knowledge how to do. Mm-hmm. Basically, what they're doing is sucking up engineers from Europe in order to set up plants in the United States. You see that from Tesla. They're not building their battery flat now in Europe. They're doing that in the United States, but they're doing that with German engineers, basically. So I'm not so much challenged by the IRA. The problem is, if you look to OECD figures, all European member states are far beyond the average of regulation of the OECD members countries. So this is practically the global world, our competitors, and in all member states we are over-regulated.
Just let me stop you there, because regarding the United States, I want to get the view from the other side of the pond now and bring in Susan Danger. She's from AmCham Europe. That's the American Chamber of Commerce that is based here in Brussels and represents the interests of American business in Europe. Our Paul Larocque-Hoppenet asked who was going to win this race to go green and at what cost to EU-US relations. Take a listen.
It shouldn't be a race. We don't need a race. Don't think it's a race. There's enough for everybody to do here. The EU and the US have a common goal here, which is to fight climate change. Both the EU and the US need to invest in clean tech. They need to invest in ensuring energy security. So there's enough for everybody here to go around. So we actually need both sides to have plans, which they do have, with regard to encouraging further investment which in itself creates jobs on both sides of the Atlantic as well. You have to remember that the EU and the US are deeply intertwined. We have European companies invested in the US and vice versa. So we don't need a race. We don't want more disputes. So there will be no race, we hope.
So Susan Danger there from AmCham, the CEO of AmCham. Mark Bottenga, you're nodding there?
Well, I mean, it's very easy to say there will not be a race, but let's be very clear. I mean, this US program and programs, because it's not the first one. You've had the infrastructure deal. You now have the IRA. You've had the US CHIPS Act as well, where the European Union is now reacting to. So it is very clear that there is a philosophy inside the United States still of America first. The slogan has changed and the rhetoric has changed, but the policies are very much directed now to putting American business first, even at the expense of what they call their best ally.
I was reading their Swedish company, Northvolt. The Swedish company is looking to the US already to expand production. I mean, what's it like for your members? Bring us into behind the scenes.
Well, as Susan Danger was saying, I mean, our economies are very intertwined. We have a lot of trade, but most of this trade is due to investments, because we have a lot of American companies investing in Europe, or a lot of European companies invested in US. So companies were already investing in US. What the IRA meant for them is that now they're going to have an extra incentive to do it, and a very good one. They created a business case for investments in clean technology. They give certainty to companies, and they give a favorable environment to do it. So this is not new. What I think it's important is indeed to make sure that we don't enter into a subsidy race. This is something we don't want to. And this could be an opportunity also for the EU and US to coordinate in this area. I mean, we've been talking a lot for a long time about industrial subsidies, how they can distort the market. We have been complaining about the Chinese, so we should try to avoid doing the same. So it's important that we are transparent, we talk to each other, and we try possibly to define common rules on how we give subsidies to companies.
This risk, of course, of a potential subsidy race that's on everyone's minds here in Brussels. When heads of state and government met this week for their summit, we saw ahead of that summit as well Giorgia Meloni, the Italian Prime Minister, saying that not to go down that route with so much at stake for Italy. And Christian Ehler, did you see your economy minister, Robert Habeck, this week over in the White House?
Yeah, I saw him compromising the European position. I mean, two national ministers in Washington, that is not going to help. I mean, if you don't do things together and protect our interests together, we're going to lose. And the outcome was sub-zero.
So you believe him going alongside Bruno Le Maire, which is the French minister, was not a good idea? They should have gone more as a 27?
It's a very odd combination. You see that the Germans want to have more state aid in order to get to overcompensate their limitations in terms of the overregulation, and France simply wants to have money for their budget. So that is not a very solid kind of new alliance. I think we should really focus on ourselves. I mean, we are challenged by the United States, but for the right reason, because they do that with incentives and we do that with regulation, and we have to deregulate, not being oversubscriptive, and simply let the industry do what they have to do to invest, but give them the breathing space to do so. And what we are doing is we are overregulating, we are strangling our own economy, and now we're pointing to the United States and saying, how could they do? They deregulate, they do it via incentives. How could they do?
Well, I think the problem with deregulation is also regarding workers' rights. It's something that the European Trade Union Confederation has put out there, because obviously deregulation, if you go into the belly dance approach, at some point the question is, should we have the same salaries, working conditions as Bangladesh? Because otherwise Bangladesh is going to be more competitive. So I don't think that's the way you need to go down. If you want decent industry here, you need the public initiative, you need the public investment, and some of the best companies on renewable energy, on the pharmaceutical industry, have been public companies. Why not go down that road? And we will not be open to blackmail from private companies. Okay.
And just very briefly, Luisa Santos, there is a task force set up between the Americans and the Europeans. Is it going anywhere? Is it working?
They are discussing and they are trying to address some of the discriminatory provisions. Of course, they've been focusing on electric vehicles, and we are seeing good moves, but we still need to see the final guidance that will come from the US government late March, to see if this progress transforms into reality. But there are a lot of other discriminatory provisions that might not be addressed.
that we will have to revisit another day here
Yes.
on Brussels, my love. And Mark Botenga, you mentioned there the rights of workers. Stick with us, because just after this break, we'll be delving into that topic, the rights of delivery drivers and Uber drivers. So stay with us here on Euronews and Euronews.com. Welcome back to Brussels, my love, with me, Maeve McMahon, where we're taking a little look back at some of the stories that caught our eye. Now, as you all know, there are demos and protests around the EU institutions in Brussels almost every day. But one that really made us turn our heads recently was this one, even though it was just a handful of people. You can take a look. That was an Uber demo organised in front of the European Parliament to raise awareness about the rights or lack of rights for Uber drivers, for platform workers, the fact that they have no rights to sick leave, health insurance or holiday pay. Mark Botenga, that demo was organised by your political party, I believe. Were you there?
It was our group indeed, and it wasn't the first one, so it was the last one because we now had the vote in plenary. And I think the vote in plenary in favour of the rights of platform workers last week was really the accomplishment of a series of mobilizations, because it started off to put pressure on the European Commission to actually come with a proposal to improve the workers' rights in this new platform economy, which indeed is about 28 million workers throughout the European Union, which were very often denied basic rights because they were being managed by algorithms but didn't get a real status. They were like fake independents or self-employed. So it was really the accomplishment, let's say, of mobilization of our group, but mostly of trade unions and collectives.
And let's just remind our viewers that this vote does not mean that tomorrow morning platform workers will be granted any rights. It means that the negotiations can kick-start, and in fact 376 MEPs voted in favour of it, 212 against and 15 abstained. You voted against it, Christian Ehler, and I saw that your group, the European People's Party, were quite divided. It was like half and half. Just tell us why you voted against it.
It's a complex issue. First of all, I mean, it's the question whether the European level is the one to regulate. I mean, this is member states' issue. It's there are 18 or 19 different labor laws in Europe, quite uncomparable. So the question is, are we in charge? And is that just a pretension, or is it something we substantially can contribute? And then we have to see that on the one hand, I wouldn't underestimate what Mr. Botenga had been saying. There's a potential that people are driven in a kind of artificial self-employment and that they don't have workers' rights. But we see also that with platform work, that is the sector where we have the most new entrepreneurs in all sectors in Europe. So we really have to differentiate where we want to protect workers' rights and where we multinationals drive people into kind of artificial self-employment. But on the other hand, we don't want to kill self-employment. There are new life models. There are people who want to work just half-time.
So you don't want to kill self-employment. That was your thinking behind that vote. What about yourself, Luisa Santos, at Business Europe? What is your take on this proposal from the Commission and the negotiations?
Well, to start with, of course, we want people to have rights and workers to have their legitimate rights. To start with, we are not in favor about schemes that undermine workers' rights. We are not in that business. That to be very clear, and this goes back to the previous discussion. But the question is, here is. We need to make sure that, like we normally say, we don't kill the baby with the bathtub water, because the important thing is we have a very flexible economy. Digital economy is very flexible, is developing, and we need to make sure that we give room for this economy to develop. So, not putting in question self-employment when we do address the issue of the platform workers, and of course also making sure that at EU level the regulation is effective, because we are talking about something that normally is regulated at national level.
Okay, well, let's listen to them. Let's hear now from the horse's mouth and take a listen to what it is like being a gig worker in a city here like Brussels. We can listen to Camille Peters. He told us he enjoys his job, but he's counting on political will to improve his situation and stop social dumping.
J'aimerais bien pouvoir travailler.
I would like to work in good conditions. Right now at this job, to make a decent living, you have to work all day long.
Consacrer sa vie entière au travail. J'ai des collègues.
Some of my colleagues are working for 70, sometimes 80 hours per week here in Brussels. Those conditions are not acceptable.
Dans la ville de Bruxelles, c'est pas des conditions acceptables. La première des choses.
The first thing we ask is for consistent status. Here in Belgium, we have a status between independent worker and employee.
On utilise ici en Belgique un statut entre les deux.
So we don't have social rights, we don't have unemployment benefits, we don't have paid leave, we don't have pension, and most of all, the platform can block our account whenever they want. It's like an unfair dismissal. It's like we're back to the 19th century.
Du licenciement sauvage.
So this is an emergency.
Peter's there speaking to us. He's not here with us, but he reckons that we're back to the 19th centuries, and he would obviously disagree with Luisa Santos and with Christian Ehler if he was sitting here beside you.
No, I wouldn't say. I mean, if you're working in a pizza delivery service and you're based on an algorithm, everyone can fire you. Rightly, we should protect workers' rights, and we should consider whether they're driven in an artificial self-employment or whatsoever. But you have people developing algorithms for Google or whatsoever. They're high-paid people. They don't want to have a social background or whatsoever. They're really entrepreneurs, so we have to differentiate.
Well, this is a very complex issue. I would imagine that the proposal that came out of the Commission that will be negotiated very soon will be watered down a lot as well by EU member states. And when we'll have a final proper bill?
Well, we've got a proposal from Parliament now. The Commission came up with a proposal, but Parliament voted its position. I think Parliament's position is better, has improved the Commission's proposal at a number of levels. We've taken out a number of criteria that the Commission wanted to make sure that workers can get indeed this presumption of employment. Which is really important because, I mean, if they have to ask for it themselves individually, it will not happen. Now, obviously, if there is a worker that is really self-employed, this presumption can be retracted. So it's not necessary. I mean, if people really are self-employed and really want to be, they can retract it. But if not, they will have, or they should have, if indeed we manage to wage this battle until the end, all the rights of an employed person, of someone that's a wage earner. And this is really important. And of course, business will always say we're not opposed to workers' rights, but we know that in the European Parliament, there's been a massive lobbying campaign of Uber.
Let's hear from Luisa Santos. You're sitting right beside one of the heads of Business Europe.
The issue here, are we tackling the problem with this regulation or not? We have certain situations that need to be addressed, like the ones of Camille. What we don't want is that this legislation will be targeting other situations where people want to be self-employed. And this is the thing, is how you do it. It's not necessarily the objective, it's the way that you're doing that we don't
propose the directive.
There's a lot of lobbying, I'm sure, around this file as well. Uber have been very busy here, but we do not have time to talk about that. That's, I'm afraid, all we have for this section on that topic. Thank you so much to our panellists, to Christian Ehler, to Mark Botenga and Luisa Santos. Thanks for being with us, and thank you for watching. We'll see you very soon here on Euronews and Euronews.com. Welcome back to Brussels, my love, with me, Maeve McMahon, where we're taking a look back at some European stories that caught our eye this week. Well, one major one that nobody could have missed this week was that of the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, touching down on European soil, first to the UK to meet the British Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, then to Paris, and then over to Brussels to the European Parliament, and also to meet EU heads of state and government at their summit. This was his second trip outside of Ukraine since the invasion began last February. Pretty symbolic, very strong images there on our screens. Mark Botenga, your reaction?
Well, I mean, it's a trip indeed to defend his position, the interests of Ukraine, and to maintain the good relations, first of all with the United Kingdom and then with the European Union, because he goes first to the United Kingdom. What else to say? I mean, the real question is, how do we get out of this war? Because I've been listening very carefully to the Pentagon recently, saying that they consider a military victory of Ukraine as in freeing from Russian occupation the entire territory of Ukraine, extremely improbable.
So beyond those images and the symbolic speeches and emotional moments, yeah, the question is how to get out of this war. Just a quick reaction from yourself?
Well, I think from the part of the European business community, of course, we have been impacted a lot by the war and by the sanctions, but we are, of course, supporting all the actions that the EU is taking as a reaction to Russia's aggression. And we're also looking actually how we can cooperate with Ukrainian business. So we are now looking at whether we can have some representatives also of Ukrainian business inside the organization. I think the big challenge is going to be indeed to end the war, how, and then the reconstruction, because that is going to be a huge effort, both financially but also human and the infrastructure side.
And your reaction, Christian?
I think it has a sad moment because it shows how important it is to be present in an attention democracy. I mean, they rightly have to fear that after 4 or 6 weeks we're simply forgetting that people are dying. There's occupied territory. The Russians behave like the Nazis had been doing that on the same territory in the Second World War. But we're living in this attention democracy, so it needs the president to be present, to make people aware that the situation didn't change. And there are two solutions out of the war. Either Ukraine is sustained and Russia will then learn that they have to negotiate and they have to stop the war, or the Russian will run over Ukraine. And that means more than an occupied Ukraine. That means that democracy is defeated in Europe at our borders. So it's fairly clear how to get out of the war, to help Ukraine to sustain. And it needs obviously a president of the Ukraine permanently to be present to remind us that it's not over because we haven't heard for 4 weeks or just a little bit or bits and pieces. But that is part of this sad story of the European attention democracy.
So you're suggesting there that Europeans have forgotten about the plight of Ukrainians. Just briefly, we don't have a lot of time left, but briefly, last week Brussels went to Kiev. Brussels went to Ukraine. There was the EU-Ukraine summit. We saw a lot of love there between the leaders of the institutions. 15 EU commissioners were there. Luisa Santos, was it worth the trip?
I think it is important, again, to show that Europe is supporting Ukraine, is with Ukraine. It's also important because if Ukraine wants to become one day a member of the EU, it's important that we also follow Ukraine in all this process, including to making sure that whatever support we are giving now is being followed according to our rules and according to our principles. That's very important. We have a lot of issues regarding transparency, etc. Sure. So it is important that we reaffirm our support, but we also say to the country, look, you need to continue to follow European values and European standards.
And Mark Botenga, the Prime Minister of Ukraine, was hoping that membership could happen within 2 years. Not possible, you think?
I don't believe that will happen, let's be clear. The visits mutually are symbolic. It's like to show how close the European Commission is, because it was almost the full Commission going there to the Ukrainian government. But it's mostly symbolic. There's a path, there's pressure to get Ukraine into the European Union. I think there's a process which will take a lot longer, so I don't believe that will be happening in the short term. I think, though, that we could stimulate diplomacy to stop the bombs as soon as possible.
Mark Botenga, thank you so much for being with us. Luisa Santos from Business Europe, thank you so much too. And thank you for watching. We'll see you soon here on Euronews and Euronews.com.